There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over rural New England in the hour before dawn. Even now, the air carries a faint mineral coolness, the smell of damp earth and old wood. And if you stand still long enough in a field at the edge of a small town, you can sometimes still make out the low stone walls that 18th century farmers built by hand, one rock lifted at a time, to mark where one family's land ended and another's began. Some of those walls are still standing. Historians and archaeologists who study them have learned to read them almost like a written record. The size of the stones, the width of the gaps, the way a wall curves gently around what was once a spring or a rock too large to move. They tell us, in their quiet way, about the people who built them. Not kings, not generals, farmers. Tonight, we are going to spend a day with one such family. Not a family whose name appears in any surviving document, but one carefully reconstructed from the kinds of records that do survive. Probate inventories listing pewter spoons and wool blankets. Diaries kept by farm wives noting the weather and the price of butter. Almanacs stained with candle wax. Church records, archaeological excavations of farmhouse foundations, and the accounts of travelers who passed through New England in the decades before the Revolution. We invite you to settle in, dim the lights if you can, and let the details of this ordinary colonial day unfold slowly. There is no danger here, no crisis, nothing that requires alertness. Just the quiet, layered rhythm of a household from nearly 250 years ago, waking, working, resting, and eventually, like you, going to sleep. Before we begin, if stories like this one, calm, historically grounded journeys into the textures of ordinary life in the past, help you rest, consider subscribing to Bedtime Story Media. It helps us continue making them. Now, let the fire burn low, and let us step quietly into the dark colonial farmhouse kitchen, just before the sky begins to change. Before we enter the farmhouse itself, it helps to understand the land it stood upon, because in colonial New England, the land and the household were never truly separate things. The Whitfield farm, like most farms of its kind, sat along a gentle rise above a river valley, the soil a mixture of glacial till and centuries of decayed leaf litter, rocky in places, generous in others. Archaeologists working in this region have noted that early colonial farmers often chose sites not for flatness or ease, but for proximity to water, for southern exposure that caught the low autumn sun, and for natural drainage that kept cellars from flooding. It is early autumn. The maples along the ridge have begun to turn, though the oaks remain mostly green, holding their color stubbornly the way oaks do. The air at night has grown sharp enough that the family has begun banking the fire more carefully, aware that the truly cold months are still ahead, but no longer distant. This is harvest season, arguably the most demanding stretch of the farming year, when the labor of an entire 12 months either pays off or falls short. New England's growing season was short compared to the colonies farther south, and farmers here learned, often through hard experience, to work within tight margins. Corn, the staple crop introduced to English colonists by indigenous farmers generations earlier, along with squash and beans, formed the backbone of subsistence agriculture in the region. Wheat grew less reliably here than in Pennsylvania or Virginia, and rye and oats often filled the gap. Historians studying agricultural records from this period note that a single-family farm typically balanced grain crops, a kitchen garden, a small orchard, pasture for livestock, and woodlot for fuel and timber, all managed with hand tools and animal labor. The Whitfield farm, as we imagine it, covers perhaps 60 or 70 acres, though only a fraction of that is actively cultivated in any given year. The rest is woodland, rocky pasture, and the low, wet meadow near the river where hay is cut in summer. This pattern was common. Land in New England was often abundant on paper, but difficult to clear and difficult to farm, full of stones that seemed to rise fresh from the earth every spring, a phenomenon farmers attributed, not entirely incorrectly, to frost heave working stones upward through the soil over winter. Surveyors and land records from this period, historians note, often described New England farmland in terms that strike modern readers as strikingly modest: a few acres of tillage here, a somewhat larger stretch of pasturage there, and a substantial remaining portion simply recorded as woodlot, valued not for cultivation, but for the steady annual yield of timber and firewood it provided. This division of land was rarely arbitrary. Generations of trial and observation had taught families like the Whitfields which slopes drained well enough for corn, which low ground flooded too often for anything but summer hay, and which stony hillsides were better left to sheep and cattle grazing than to the plow. The river itself, though not visible from the farmhouse door, shapes the valley's character in ways felt more than seen. Its floodplain enriches the soil nearest its banks, while its seasonal rise and fall, historians studying regional hydrology note, made certain low fields unreliable for anything planted too early in spring. Farmers of this period developed an intimate, largely unwritten knowledge of these patterns, knowledge passed down through direct instruction from one generation to the next, rather than through any formal agricultural text. The farmhouse itself sits with its back somewhat to the prevailing northwest wind, a common orientation choice that helped shelter the building from the harshest winter gusts. A stand of sugar maples grows near the house, useful in late winter for tapping, and an orchard of perhaps a dozen apple trees stretches along the southern slope, planted by Elias's father and now beginning to produce reliably. This morning, before anyone in the house has stirred, frost has settled lightly across the low meadow grass, the first hint of frost the family has seen this season. It will burn off within the hour once the sun clears the tree line, but its presence tonight is a quiet signal, the kind farmers of this era learn to read carefully. The corn, mostly harvested already and hanging in golden braids in the corn crib, has been brought in just in time. The pumpkins and squash still lie heavy in the garden rows, their skins hardening in preparation for weeks of storage ahead. Historians who study almanacs from this period, cheap, widely circulated publications that combined weather predictions, planting advice, moral aphorisms, and astronomical tables, note that farm families relied on these small books heavily, pinning notes into their pages, using them as informal diaries. Elias keeps one such almanac on a shelf near the hearth, its cover soft with handling, and though he cannot always trust its weather predictions, he trusts its planting calendar and its record of moon phases, which many farmers of the period believed influenced certain kinds of work, from planting root vegetables to butchering livestock. The land, in other words, is not simply the backdrop to the story we are about to tell. It is a participant. Every task inside the farmhouse today will be shaped by what the season demands outside it. And so, as the sky over the ridge begins almost imperceptibly to lighten from black toward the deep blue-gray of early dawn, we turn now toward the house itself and the family beginning, one by one, to awake. The farmhouse is dark, but not silent. A colonial home of this size and period, perhaps 30 by 20 feet on its main floor, with a low loft above, held sound differently than a modern house does. Thin plank floors, exposed ceiling beams, and shared sleeping spaces meant that little happened in the household without everyone eventually becoming aware of it. Margaret Whitfield is the first to rise, as she is most mornings. Historians of colonial domestic life note that farm wives typically woke before their husbands and children, tending first to the fire, which in most households was never allowed to go out entirely. Rather than striking a new fire each morning, a genuinely difficult task with flint, steel, and tinder, families banked their hearth fires overnight, covering hot coals with ash to keep them smoldering slowly until morning, when they could be uncovered, fed with kindling, and coaxed back into flame. Margaret kneels at the hearth in the dim gray light beginning to filter through the small, deep-set windows, most of which are glazed with small diamond-shaped panes of glass, expensive enough that the household is glad to have them, though they let in only a modest amount of light compared to modern glass. She scrapes back the ash carefully with an iron tool kept beside the hearth for exactly this purpose, revealing a bed of orange coals beneath. A handful of dry pine shavings, kept in a small box nearby specifically for this purpose, catches almost immediately. There is a particular skill to this work that archaeologists and historical reenactors alike have come to appreciate only by attempting it themselves. Too much kindling too quickly can smother young flame. Too little patience, and the fire dies before it catches. Margaret's hands move through motions so practiced they require almost no conscious thought, the muscle memory of thousands of mornings. As the fire strengthens, she sets a small iron kettle on a hook that swings out from the side of the hearth, a simple but ingenious device found in nearly every colonial kitchen, allowing the cook to move a heavy, hot vessel toward or away from the flame without needing to lift it directly over the fire itself. Upstairs, in the low loft space, reached by a narrow, steep staircase, little more than a ladder, the children begin to stir. Josiah, at 14, sleeps nearest the chimney, where a small amount of warmth rises from the floorboards from the fire below, a modest but valued comfort in a house where upper rooms typically grew quite cold overnight, particularly as autumn deepens. Ruth and Sarah share a narrower bed on the opposite side of the loft, beneath a heavy woolen coverlet that Margaret and her mother wove themselves the previous winter. Elias rises shortly after his wife, dressing quickly in the cold air of the bedroom on the main floor. In many farmhouses of this period, the parents' sleeping space occupied a small room just off the main kitchen hall, called sometimes a bourning room, used both for sleeping and, as its name suggests, for childbirth. He pulls on wool stockings, breeches, and a linen shirt that has clearly seen years of wear and careful mending, along with a heavier wool waistcoat against the morning chill. There is no clock striking the hour in this household, though a modest clock does exist in some wealthier colonial homes of this period. For the Whitfields, time is marked instead by light, by the crowing of the rooster in the yard, by the habits of a lifetime. Historians studying colonial timekeeping note that rural households organized their days around natural and agricultural rhythms far more than around precise hours, a pattern that would only begin shifting significantly with the spread of affordable clocks and later industrial work schedules in the following century. Even without a clock, however, the household's sense of time was rarely vague. Elias could judge the hour reasonably well by the quality of light through the small windows, by the particular birds beginning to call outside, and by decades of simply having risen at roughly the same point in the morning nearly every day of his working life.
Historians who study colonial almanacs note that many included simple tables allowing farmers to estimate the hour from the length and direction of a shadow cast by a fixed object, a method some households used deliberately, though for a family as practiced in its daily rhythm as the Whitfields, such calculation was rarely necessary. The cold itself carries its own kind of information this morning. Margaret notices, kneeling at the hearth, that her breath is faintly visible in the dim light of the kitchen, a small but unmistakable sign of just how far the temperature has dropped overnight. It is not yet the deep cold of true winter, but it is cold enough to remind the household that the season is turning and that certain preparations still incomplete will need to be finishing soon. Goodwife Anne, Margaret's mother, moves more slowly these mornings, her joints stiff with age and the damp New England cold, but she is already awake, seated near the hearth on a low three-legged stool, her hands beginning the day's first task even before full light, carding wool, pulling raw fibers between two paddles studded with fine wire teeth to align them for spinning later. It is quiet, repetitive work, well suited to failing eyesight and aching hands, and in households like this one, elderly family members typically remained active contributors to domestic production for as long as they were physically able. Outside, the sky continues its slow shift from black to deep blue to the pale gray that precedes true dawn. Somewhere across the yard, in the barn, the animals are beginning to stir as well, sensing, as animals do, the change in light and air. The day has not yet fully begun, but already in the space of these few quiet minutes before sunrise, the machinery of an entire household, fire, food, warmth, wool, and the deep, unspoken coordination of a family that has done this every morning of their lives, has started turning once again.
The kitchen of a colonial New England farmhouse was, in nearly every meaningful sense, the center of the home. It was not a separate room devoted only to cooking, as we might think of a kitchen today, but a combined kitchen, dining, and general living area, often called simply the hall or the keeping room. Here the family cooked, ate, worked, mended clothing, told stories in the evening, and gathered whenever the weather made outdoor activity uncomfortable, which in New England was often. At the center of this room stands the hearth, not a small fireplace in the modern decorative sense, but an enormous stone or brick structure, sometimes 6 or 7 feet wide, capable of burning substantial logs and supporting an array of ironwork, hooks, cranes, trammels, and hangers designed to hold pots at varying heights above the flame. Archaeological excavations of colonial farmhouse foundations have revealed the sheer scale of these hearths, and probate inventories from the period frequently list dozens of individual iron and pewter cooking implements, evidence of just how much specialized equipment a working colonial kitchen required. Margaret works now at this hearth, preparing the morning meal. A cast-iron pot already containing the remains of last night's supper, likely a thick pottage of corn, beans, and whatever meat or salt pork was available, kept warm or reheated rather than wasted, hangs from an adjustable crane that allows her to swing it away from the fire without needing thick protective gloves, though a folded cloth serves that purpose when direct contact is unavoidable. Nearby, a shallow iron pan sits propped on legs directly among the coals, used for baking small items like johnny cakes, a simple cornmeal flatbread that historians identify as one of the most common breakfast foods in colonial New England households, born from indigenous corn-based cooking traditions adapted by English settlers. The batter, a mixture of cornmeal, water or milk, and a pinch of salt, requires no yeast and can be prepared quickly,
an important consideration in households where mornings moved with real urgency. The room itself smells of wood smoke, always, a smell so constant in colonial households that it likely became almost unnoticeable to those who lived there permanently, the way we no longer notice familiar background smells in our own homes. Beneath that lingering wood smoke this morning is the sharper scent of cornmeal beginning to toast against hot iron, and beneath that, faintly, the earthy smell of the root cellar accessible through a trap door near the room's far wall, where potatoes, turnips, and onions from the recent harvest are being stored for the winter ahead. Along the walls, the kitchen holds the practical clutter of a working household. Wooden shelves hold pewter plates and cups, valuable enough that inventories from this period often list them individually by weight and worth. A large wooden dry sink sits beneath one window, used for washing dishes with water carried in by hand, since indoor plumbing did not exist in rural households of this era. Herbs, dried mint, sage, and other plants gathered from the kitchen garden over the summer hang in small bundles from the exposed ceiling beams, both for cooking use and, in some cases, for their believed medicinal properties, a practice well documented in colonial household manuals and herbals of the period. A simple wooden table, its surface worn smooth and slightly uneven from decades of use, dominates the center of the room, flanked by benches rather than individual chairs, which were often reserved for the head of household or for guests. This table will serve in the course of a single day as a surface for cooking preparation, for eating, for sewing, for the children's occasional lessons, and later tonight for mending by candlelight. Historians studying colonial material culture emphasize that furniture in households like this one was rarely decorative in the way we might imagine antique furniture today. It was functional, often handmade by the farmer himself or by a local joiner, built to withstand generations of hard daily use. Several pieces in the Whitfield kitchen, in fact, were made by Elias's own father, and Elias intends, eventually, to pass them along to Josiah. The implements themselves reward closer attention. A trammel, an adjustable iron chain and hook device, allows the height of a hanging pot above the fire to be changed easily, giving the cook a rough but workable form of temperature control, long before any dial or thermometer existed for the purpose. A long-handled iron spider, its 3 short legs designed to stand steady among glowing coals, sits ready near the hearth for frying, while a shallow reflector oven, positioned to catch radiant heat from the fire, offers a means of baking small items without requiring a separate brick oven, though the household does also possess a beehive-shaped brick oven built into the side of the chimney, used primarily on baking days, when bread, pies, or other larger items are prepared in quantity. Historians who have studied surviving probate inventories from modest New England farms note just how extensive this collection of specialized ironware could become across a lifetime of household accumulation. Pots of varying sizes, toasting forks, ladles, skimmers, and trivets, each suited to a particular task, together representing a genuinely significant portion of a family's total household wealth. As the johnny cakes begin to brown and the pottage warms through, Margaret calls softly up the loft stairs, and the sounds of the household beginning to gather, footsteps on wooden floors, the creak of the stair ladder, Sarah's small voice asking a sleepy question, signal that the family's day, in earnest, is about to begin. By the time the family gathers at the long wooden table, the sky outside has brightened considerably, though the sun itself has not yet cleared the ridge to the east. Breakfast in a household like the Whitfields was typically a modest but substantial meal, intended to provide enough energy for hours of physical labor ahead, since the next opportunity to eat properly would not come until midday. Elias takes his customary seat at the head of the table, a chair with arms, one of the few chairs in the household, most family members sitting instead on simple benches along either side. This arrangement, historians note, reflected broader patterns of authority within colonial households, where the male head of family typically held a recognized position of both spiritual and practical leadership, formally acknowledged even in small physical details like seating. Before eating, the family pauses for a brief grace, a common practice across colonial New England households, regardless of the particular strand of Protestant Christianity a given family followed. In this region, during this period, Congregationalist practice, descended from the earlier Puritan settlers, remained widespread, though by the 1770s, religious diversity across New England had grown considerably, with Baptist, Anglican, and other congregations increasingly present. The Whitfields, like many farm families, observe religious custom as a quiet, integrated part of daily life, rather than a separate or especially dramatic occasion. Grace before meals, evening prayer, and attendance at the local meeting house on the Sabbath, all treated as ordinary rhythms of existence rather than remarkable events. The meal itself consists of the warmed pottage from the previous evening, the freshly baked johnny cakes, and a modest serving of milk for the children, drawn from the family's single dairy cow the previous evening. Adults in colonial households often drank a mild beer or cider with meals, rather than plain water, which was not always considered safe or palatable, though morning milk was common for children specifically. Historians studying colonial diet note that this reliance on fermented beverages was as much practical as cultural, since fermentation offered some protection against waterborne illness in an era before understanding of microbial contamination. Conversation around the table this morning is quiet and practical. Elias mentions that the far field's corn stubbles should be cleared today in preparation for winter, and that Josiah will be needed to help. Margaret notes that the last of the apples should be brought in from the orchard before any hard frost damages them further, a task she plans to assign to Ruth and Sarah together. Goodwife Anne says little, as is her habit in the mornings, though she listens closely, occasionally offering a brief comment drawn from decades of her own experience managing a household. Josiah, now 14, occupies a position in the family that historians describe as transitional, old enough to perform substantial physical labor alongside his father, effectively functioning as a junior farmhand, but still years away from the independence that would eventually come with adulthood, marriage, and, ideally, land of his own. Farm boys of this age in colonial New England typically spent the bulk of their waking hours engaged in agricultural labor, with formal schooling, if it existed at all, often limited to a few months during the winter when farm work slowed considerably. Ruth, at 11, sits closer to her mother, already deeply involved in the domestic labor that would occupy most of her adult life: spinning, food preparation, garden work, and increasingly instruction from her mother and grandmother in the countless small skills required to manage a colonial household. Historians studying colonial dress note that such clothing was rarely purchased ready-made, instead cut and sewn at home from cloth, either woven within the household itself or purchased by the yard from the local store, then adjusted and readjusted across years as children grew and garments wore. Breakfast does not linger long. There is no leisurely conversation of the kind we might associate with a modern family meal. The demands of the day press close, and within perhaps 20 minutes, the family begins rising from the table, each moving towards the specific tasks that will occupy the hours ahead. Elias and Josiah to the barn and fields, Margaret, Ruth, and Sarah towards the garden kitchen and the orchard, Goodwife Anne back to her wool. The rhythm of a colonial farm day, historians frequently observe, was defined less by individual choice than by an intricate, largely unspoken division of labor, one that had been refined across generations, and that every member of the household, even the youngest, understood almost instinctively. As the Whitfields disperse from their table this morning, that rhythm carries them, as it has carried them every morning before, into the working day ahead.
Before following the family further into their day's labor, it is worth pausing to consider the farmhouse itself more closely, because the structure of colonial homes reveals a great deal about the priorities, resources, and daily realities of families like the Whitfields. The house is what architectural historians typically classify as a hall and parlor, or in its slightly more developed form, a salt box design. Named for its distinctive silhouette, a steeply pitched roofline that extends low at the back of the house, giving the building a shape reminiscent of the wooden salt storage boxes common in colonial kitchens. This design, widespread throughout New England by the mid-18th century, offered practical advantages. The long rear roofline helped shed snow efficiently and provided additional interior space, often used for storage or a lean-to kitchen addition, without requiring the expense of a full second story across the entire structure. Construction methods for buildings of this kind relied on heavy timber framing, thick oak or chestnut beams, hand-hewn with axes and shaped further with adzes, joined together using mortise and tenon joints secured with wooden pegs rather than iron nails, which remained relatively expensive and were used more sparingly, primarily for finishing work, like flooring and clapboard siding. Archaeological and architectural surveys of surviving colonial-era frames have revealed the remarkable durability of this construction technique, with some original timber frames from this period still standing, structurally sound, centuries later. The exterior walls are covered with wooden clapboards, overlapping horizontal boards that shed rainwater effectively, left unpainted or treated simply, since decorative paint remained a relative luxury for modest farm households, more common among wealthier merchant or town families. The roof is covered with wooden shingles, split by hand from straight-grained logs, a labor-intensive but locally available roofing material throughout wooded New England. Inside, the house is organized around that massive central chimney we have already described, which served not only the main kitchen hearth, but also, in many farmhouses, a second smaller fireplace opening into an adjoining parlor or best room, a more formal space reserved for special occasions, honored guests, and notably for laying out the deceased during funeral observances, a somber but practical use of the household's most presentable room. The Whitfield household's parlor, modest as it is, contains their best furniture, a small collection of pewter, and possibly a few pieces of imported ceramic ware, and serves as a kind of quiet reserve space, used only occasionally. Windows throughout the house remain small by modern standards, both to conserve the heat generated by the hearth and because glass itself remained a genuinely valuable material, imported or produced at real expense. The diamond-paned castment windows common earlier in the colonial period had by the 1770s increasingly given way to larger double-hung sash windows in wealthier households, though many rural farmhouses, including one like the Whitfields, still retained smaller, simpler window openings that let in modest amounts of daylight. The loft space above the main floor, reached by that narrow ladder-like staircase, provides sleeping quarters for the children, insulated somewhat by the rising warmth of the chimney passing through the space, but still considerably colder than the rooms below during winter months. Historians studying colonial domestic arrangements note that privacy in the modern sense was largely absent from households of this kind,
Family members slept in shared or adjoining spaces, dressed and undressed within earshot, if not sight, of one another, and lived in far closer physical proximity than most households would consider comfortable today. Outbuildings surround the main house, a barn considerably larger than the house itself in many colonial farms, reflecting the genuine economic priority placed on protecting livestock and stored grain. A small corn crib raised off the ground on posts to deter rodents. A woodshed, it's critical to the household's survival through the coming winter, and typically a small outbuilding used as a privy, since indoor sanitation facilities did not exist. A well, dug by hand and lined with fieldstone, providing the household's water supply, drawn up by rope and bucket, a task performed multiple times daily by whichever family member's other duties happened to bring them near it. The overall arrangement of house and outbuildings, historians studying colonial farmstead layout note, were rarely accidental, reflecting generations of practical adjustment aimed at minimizing unnecessary walking distance between related tasks. The well close to the kitchen door, the woodshed within easy reach of both the barn and kitchen, the corn crib positioned for convenient access from the fields where the harvest was gathered. Such layouts, refined gradually across a farm's working life, represented a kind of accumulated practical wisdom passed down alongside the land itself from one generation of a family to the next. The interior walls of the main rooms are typically finished with plaster over riven lath, a labor-intensive process involving splitting thin strips of wood and nailing them across the exposed studs before applying several coats of lime-based plaster allowed to dry and cure between applications. In more modest farmhouses, or in less frequently used rooms, exposed wooden sheathing boards sometimes substitute for full plastering, a practical compromise that saved both material cost and labor time. Floors throughout the house are wide wooden planks, sawn from local timber, laid directly over the floor joists and left largely unfinished, apart from the smoothing effect of years of foot traffic and regular sweeping. Taken together, this farmhouse represents neither poverty nor wealth by the standards of its time, but something closer to the broad middle experience of rural colonial life, a household that works hard, produces most of what it consumes, purchases relatively little from outside markets, and measures its comfort not in luxury, but in warmth, food security, and the simple, durable soundness of the structure sheltering it. As the morning light strengthens fully now over the ridge, we turn from the house itself back towards its inhabitants and towards the barn, where Elias and Josiah have already begun their morning work among the animals.
The barn stands perhaps 40 paces from the farmhouse, a substantial timber-framed structure considerably taller than the house. Its interior organized around a wide central threshing floor, flanked by stalls, storage bays for hay, and a loft above holding the recently completed grain harvest. Elias and Josiah enter through the large barn doors, currently propped open to let in the pale morning light, since the barn itself has no windows of significant size, a common feature of colonial barns, which prioritized structural integrity and weather protection over illumination. The animals stir at their approach, accustomed by now to this daily routine. The Whitfield farm keeps, as was typical of a middling New England farm of this period, a modest number of livestock, one milk cow, a pair of oxen used primarily for heavy field work and hauling, several pigs kept largely for meat production, and a small flock of chickens that range somewhat freely around the farmyard during the day. Josiah's first task is mucking out the stalls, a physically demanding but essential daily chore, removing accumulated manure and soiled bedding straw, which will later be composted and eventually spread on the fields as fertilizer, an early and practical form of agricultural recycling well understood by colonial farmers, even without the scientific vocabulary we might use to describe soil nutrients today.
Historians studying colonial agricultural practice note that manure management represented a genuinely sophisticated understanding of soil fertility developed through generations of practical observation rather than formal scientific study. Elias, meanwhile, tends to the oxen, checking their hooves and the condition of the wooden yoke that will be used later that morning for hauling corn stubble from the far field. Oxen, rather than horses, remained the primary draft animals on many New England farms throughout this period, valued for their strength, relatively lower feed requirements, and steady, patient temperament, though they moved more slowly than horses across a field. Historians note that the choice between oxen and horses often reflected a farm's specific needs and resources. Horses offered speed, advantageous for transportation and lighter tasks, while oxen provided superior raw pulling power for the heaviest agricultural work. The milk cow requires attention as well, though the actual milking, in households organized like the Whitfields, typically fell to Margaret or occasionally Ruth. Women's domestic labor in colonial New England frequently included full responsibility for dairy production, milking, and later churning butter and pressing cheese. This morning, however, Elias checks the cow's feed and water before the milking itself takes place slightly later. The pigs, kept in a fenced enclosure near the barn, receive the household's food scraps along with whatever additional feed can be spared, and represent a critical component of the farm's meat supply. Colonial New England households typically slaughtered hogs in late autumn, once cold weather arrived reliably enough to allow meat preservation through salting and smoking without spoilage, an event still some weeks away for the Whitfields, but one already being planned for, since the timing of hog slaughter required careful attention to weather patterns. Chickens scatter and regroup around the barnyard as Josiah moves through his chores, occasionally darting close in search of scattered grain. Eggs, gathered daily from nesting boxes inside the barn, provide the household with both a dietary staple and, occasionally, a modest source of trade or barter income, since surplus eggs and butter were among the most common goods rural farm wives exchanged at local stores for items the household could not produce itself, from imported tea to manufactured cloth, needles, or nails. This barter economy, historians emphasize, formed an essential part of colonial rural life, particularly for households like the Whitfields that operated largely outside formal cash transactions. Account books surviving from country stores of this period frequently show running tallies of butter, eggs, homespun cloth, and farm produce exchanged for goods, sometimes over months or years, reflecting an economy built as much on ongoing relationships and mutual trust as on immediate payment. A small flock of sheep, perhaps a dozen animals, occupies a fenced pasture adjoining the barn, their wool the raw material behind Goodwife Ann's steady carding and spinning. Josiah checks briefly on the flock this morning as well, counting the animals by habit and glancing for any sign of trouble at the fence line, since sheep on New England farms of this period remained vulnerable to predation, particularly from wolves in more remote areas, though by the 1770s, in the longer settled river valley where the Whitfields farm, such threats had grown considerably rarer than in the region's earlier colonial decades. Shearing itself, a springtime task, lies months away, but the flock's steady presence throughout the year underlies nearly everything the household produces in cloth. As the morning progresses, father and son work largely in comfortable, practiced silence, occasionally exchanging brief practical instructions. This quiet, working companionship between fathers and sons on colonial farms is well documented in surviving diaries and reminiscences from the period, describing a relationship built less around conversation than around shared labor, observation, and gradually increasing responsibility as young men like Josiah slowly absorbed the accumulated agricultural knowledge of the generation before them. By the time the barn chores near completion, the sun has cleared the ridge fully, and the true work of the harvest day, the corn stubble waiting in the far field, calls them both onward.
The far field lies perhaps a quarter-mile from the farmhouse, reached by a cart track worn smooth over years of use, bordered on either side by the low stone walls so characteristic of the New England landscape. Walls that farmers like Elias and his father before him built gradually, season by season, as stone surfaced from the plowed earth. This particular field, roughly 4 acres, produced the family's corn crop this year, already harvested in the preceding weeks, the ears gathered, husked, and now hanging to dry in golden braids inside the corn crib near the barn. What remains standing in the field are the corn stalks themselves, tall, dry, rustling stubble that must now be cleared to prepare the field for its next agricultural use, whether that means winter fallow, a cover crop, or eventual spring plowing. Elias and Josiah work with the ox team this morning, using a simple wooden implement to pull and gather the dried corn stalks, which will themselves be put to use as animal fodder through the winter months, as material for rough thatching or insulation, or simply as additional compost material. Colonial farming, historians frequently note, operated according to principles of near total resource use. Very little from the land went entirely to waste, a necessity born of genuine scarcity rather than any particular philosophical commitment to sustainability, though the practical result was much the same. The work itself is physically demanding, repetitive, and on a clear autumn morning like this one, not unpleasant. The air carries the dry, slightly sweet smell of cured corn stalks, mixed with the earthier smell of turned soil and the animal scent of the oxen working steadily ahead. Historians studying colonial agricultural labor emphasize how physically demanding daily farm work actually was, requiring sustained strength and endurance that modern audiences, accustomed to mechanized agriculture, sometimes underestimate. Josiah, working alongside his father, handles increasingly substantial responsibility as he grows older, guiding the ox team himself for stretches at a time, managing tools independently, and gradually taking on tasks that only a few years ago would have required his father's direct supervision. This gradual transfer of skill and responsibility from father to son, historians note, represented the primary form of agricultural education available to colonial farm boys, far more significant in shaping their eventual competence than any formal schooling they might have received. The fields surrounding the Whitfield farm, and indeed much of colonial New England's agricultural landscape, reflected generations of accumulated labor and land management. Forests had been cleared gradually, often over decades. The enormous labor of felling trees, removing stumps, and clearing stones from newly opened fields represented one of the most significant investments a farm family could make. Land that appeared to labor observers as simple open farmland, in fact represented the accumulated physical labor of multiple generations. Crop rotation, while not practiced with the systematic scientific understanding that would develop later, was nonetheless understood empirically by farmers like Elias, who recognized that certain fields performed better after periods of fallow rest or after being planted with different crops in succession. Corn, historians note, was frequently rotated with other crops or allowed periods of rest, since farmers had observed through generations of practical experience that continuous corn cultivation gradually depleted soil productivity, even without a modern scientific vocabulary to explain precisely why. As mid-morning progresses, the work continues steadily. Occasionally, father and son pause briefly to adjust the ox yoke, to clear stones uncovered in the stubble, or simply to catch their breath before continuing.
These brief pauses offer some of the only extended conversational moments in an otherwise largely wordless morning work, and surviving diaries from farmers of this period occasionally record such moments, brief exchanges about weather, about neighboring farms, about the small joys and frustrations of agricultural life, offering historians rare glimpses into the interior emotional lives of men who otherwise left little written record of their inner thoughts. The stone walls bordering this far field deserve a moment's further attention, since they represent, in their own quiet way, a kind of accumulated historical record. Historians and archaeologists who study New England's field walls note that their construction intensified considerably during the 18th century as land clearance expanded and as farms increasingly favored stone fencing over the wooden rail fences more common in the region's earlier colonial period, wood having grown somewhat scarcer and more valuable for other purposes as populations grew and nearby forests thinned. The wall bordering the Whitfield's far field was built gradually, Elias knows, largely by his own father's hands across several decades, each stone lifted and placed as it surfaced from the plowed soil, the wall itself functioning simultaneously as boundary marker, livestock barrier, and simply a place to put stones that would otherwise have fouled a plow blade. By the time the sun approaches its highest point in the sky, Elias and Josiah have cleared a substantial portion of the field, the gathered corn stalks stacked in loose shocks, awaiting transport back toward the barn. The morning's heaviest labor is, for now, largely complete, and thoughts for both father and son begin turning toward the midday meal awaiting them back at the farmhouse.
While Elias and Josiah labor in the far field, Margaret, Ruth, and goodwife Anne remain occupied with the equally demanding, though differently structured, labor that fell to women within colonial farm households. Historians of colonial gender roles emphasize that the popular modern image of women's domestic work as somehow lighter or less economically significant than men's field labor badly misrepresents the reality of colonial households, where women's production, dairy, textiles, food preservation, and garden cultivation often represented a substantial portion of a family's total economic output, sometimes providing the household's only access to cash or tradable goods. This morning, Margaret first completes the milking, a task performed twice daily, morning and evening, requiring both physical skill and considerable patience. The milk, once gathered, is strained through cloth into shallow pans and set aside in the cooler space of the buttery, a small room or section of the cellar dedicated specifically to dairy production, where the cream will be allowed to rise naturally over the following day before being skimmed off for butter making. Butter production itself, when the time comes, requires vigorous sustained churning, cream poured into a wooden churn and agitated repeatedly with a plunger-like dasher until the butterfat separates from the surrounding buttermilk, a process that could take anywhere from 20 minutes to well over an hour, depending on temperature, cream quality, and simple luck. Historians note that butter churning represented one of the more physically strenuous regular tasks assigned to colonial farm wives and their daughters, often shared or rotated among household members precisely because of its demanding nature. While the cream from this morning's milking sets aside to rise, Margaret turns to the kitchen garden, located just beyond the dooryard, a modest but carefully tended plot producing a range of vegetables and herbs, cabbages, onions, turnips, beans, and various culinary and medicinal herbs, including sage, thyme, and mint. Ruth works alongside her mother this morning, continuing the harvest of the season's remaining produce before hard frost arrives.
Colonial kitchen gardens, historians studying material culture and archaeological plant remains have noted, served purposes well beyond simple food production. Herbs grown here provided flavoring for food, remedies for common ailments, and occasionally dyes for textile production, reflecting the genuinely integrated multi-purpose approach colonial households took towards domestic cultivation. Goodwife Anne, meanwhile, remained seated near the hearth, continuing her wool carding from earlier in the morning, occasionally shifting to actual spinning once a sufficient quantity of carded wool had accumulated. The spinning wheel, a substantial wooden device positioned near a window for adequate light, represents one of the most important pieces of domestic technology in the colonial household, allowing raw wool, painstakingly sheared from the family's small flock of sheep months earlier, washed, carded, and now spun, to be transformed gradually into usable thread and yarn. Textile production, historians emphasize, consumed an extraordinary amount of colonial women's labor time, from the initial processing of raw fiber through spinning, weaving, and eventual sewing into finished garments and household textiles. A single household's need for clothing, bedding, and other cloth goods represented months, even years, of cumulative labor, work that continued steadily throughout the year, regardless of season, filling the hours between more physically demanding seasonal tasks like gardening and harvest. The concept of homespun cloth, produced entirely within the household from raw fiber to finished textile, carried genuine economic and even later political significance in colonial America. Households capable of producing their own cloth reduced dependence on imported British textiles, a fact that would take on particular importance in the years of growing colonial resistance to British trade policy that lay just ahead of the Whitfields. Though on this ordinary autumn morning, such considerations remain distant from the immediate, practical rhythm of Goodwife Anne's spinning wheel. Wool was not the household's only textile fiber. A small plot near the kitchen garden had, earlier in the summer, produced a modest crop of flax, its fibers processed through a laborious sequence of retting, breaking, and scutching before being spun into linen thread, considerably finer and cooler than wool, and typically reserved for undergarments, shirts, and summer clothing. Historians studying colonial textile production note that flax processing was among the more physically disagreeable tasks of the agricultural calendar, involving weeks of soaking the cut stalks in water to loosen their fibers from the surrounding woody stem, a process that produced a notably unpleasant smell. Farm families of this era simply learned to tolerate as a necessary cost of producing their own linen. By late morning, the women's various tasks, dairy, garden, textile work, have proceeded steadily alongside the men's field work, each thread of labor operating largely independently but converging, as the whole household's efforts always did, towards the shared necessities of feeding, clothing, and sheltering the family through the demanding season ahead.
Sarah, the youngest of the Whitefield children, at 6 years old, occupies a somewhat different position within the household's working rhythm than her older siblings, though even at her young age, colonial childhood offered little of the extended work-free period modern audiences might associate with early childhood. This morning, Sarah has been given the task of gathering the last apples from the lower branches of the orchard trees, branches low enough for a small child to reach safely, while Ruth, working from a small ladder, manages the higher branches. Historians studying colonial childhood emphasize that children were integrated into household labor from a remarkably young age, not from any particular harshness of intention, but because the household's survival genuinely depended on the contribution of every capable member, however small that contribution might be. The apple harvest itself represents an important task for the household's food security through the winter months ahead. Apples could be stored fresh for a considerable time in a cool cellar, dried into rings for longer preservation, pressed into cider, both fresh and, eventually, fermented hard cider, a staple beverage throughout colonial New England, or cooked down into preserves and sauces. The orchard, planted by Elias's father decades earlier, now provides a genuinely significant portion of the household's fruit supply. Between tasks, Sarah's education, such as it exists at this stage of her life, occurs almost entirely informally, embedded within the practical work of the day. Margaret and Ruth both take opportunities throughout the morning to name plants, explain simple tasks, and correct small mistakes, a pattern of learning through doing that historians identify as the primary educational method for colonial farm children, particularly girls, whose formal schooling, where available at all, was typically far more limited than that offered to boys. Formal schooling in colonial New England varied considerably by town, family resources, and gender. Massachusetts and Connecticut both maintained legal requirements dating back to the 17th century that towns of sufficient size provide some form of basic schooling, primarily intended to ensure sufficient literacy for religious purposes, the ability to read scripture being considered a genuine spiritual and civic necessity. In practice, rural district schools of this period typically operated only during winter months when farm labor demands eased considerably, and attendance, particularly for older boys needed for field work and older girls needed for household production, remained inconsistent. Josiah, at 14, has likely already completed whatever limited formal schooling his family arranged for him, his education from this point forward continuing primarily through the practical agricultural apprenticeship he undergoes daily alongside his father. Ruth, at 11, may still attend a winter school session when one is available in the family's town, though her daily education continues simultaneously through the domestic training she receives from her mother and grandmother. Literacy rates in colonial New England, historians note, were notably high by the standards of the broader Atlantic world of this period, particularly among men, reflecting the strong Puritan-descended emphasis on scriptural literacy that shaped the region's educational institutions from its earliest settlement. Female literacy, while somewhat lower on average, particularly for the ability to write rather than simply read, was nonetheless significant compared to many other regions and periods, again reflecting this same underlying religious and cultural emphasis on individual scripture reading. The Whitfield household possesses a small number of books beyond Elias's almanac, a Bible, certainly, likely the household's most valued possession, along with perhaps a psalter and one or two other religious or practical texts. Reading aloud from these books, particularly the Bible, occurs periodically within the household's routine, most commonly in the evening, when the day's labor has concluded and the family gathers together in the fading light. Even within this demanding daily schedule, moments of genuine childhood play were not entirely absent, historians are careful to note, cautioning against an overly grim popular image of colonial childhood as pure, unrelieved labor. Surviving accounts and archaeological finds of simple toys, carved wooden animals, cloth dolls, marbles, and homemade balls suggest that children like Sarah and Ruth found brief opportunities for play woven in between their assigned tasks, whether a few stolen minutes chasing each other around the dooryard or a quiet game invented with whatever small objects came to hand while performing otherwise repetitive chores like apple gathering. As late morning progresses towards midday, the various threads of the household's labor, Elias and Josiah's field work, Margaret and Ruth's garden and dairy work, Goodwife Anne's spinning, Sarah's small contributions to the orchard harvest, begin drawing gradually towards a shared pause,
as thoughts throughout the farm turn towards the midday meal that will soon bring the scattered family briefly back together.
Between the farmhouse and the barn lies the dooryard, a packed earth space that served, in households like the Whitfields, as a genuine center of daily activity, a transitional zone between the private domestic interior of the house and the working agricultural landscape beyond it. At the edge of this dooryard stands the well, its stone-lined shaft descending perhaps 20 or 30 feet to the water table below, capped with a simple wooden frame and a rope and bucket mechanism, sometimes assisted by a simple pulley to ease the labor of drawing water up from such depth. Historians studying colonial water systems note that well placement required careful consideration, balancing proximity to the house for convenience against the need to avoid contamination from the privy, the barnyard, and other sources of waste, and understanding rural households developed through practical observation and experience, even without formal knowledge of waterborne disease transmission. Water drawn from this well serves every conceivable household purpose. Drinking, though, as noted earlier, adults often preferred cider or small beer for regular consumption. Cooking, washing, and, though less frequently than modern households might assume, bathing, which colonial families generally undertook far less regularly than modern hygiene standards would suggest, though this reflected the genuine practical difficulty of heating sufficient water and the widespread period belief that frequent full bathing could actually be harmful to health, a view we now understand to be mistaken, but one genuinely held by many people of this era. Throughout the morning, various family members have made repeated trips to the well, each carrying water back toward the house or barn in wooden buckets, a task historians describe as one of the most physically taxing routine chores of colonial domestic life, given both the weight of full water buckets and the frequency with which fresh water was required throughout the day. The dooryard itself, beyond the well, typically served multiple additional practical purposes. It was here that outdoor tasks requiring space and daylight, but not full field access, took place. Washing larger textiles like blankets when the household's periodic wash day arrived, slaughtering and dressing poultry for the table, splitting kindling from larger wood firewood logs, and, this time of year particularly, processing the harvest, since a dooryard offered ample flat space for activities like husking corn, a task sometimes performed communally with neighboring families in what were called husking bees, combining necessary labor with genuine social occasion. Chickens continue moving through this space throughout the day, along with, on some colonial farms, other small domestic animals, and the dooryard often contained, in addition to its practical functions, small decorative or useful plantings, herbs, sometimes flowers, planted close to the house both for convenience and for the simple pleasure of cultivated beauty close to the domestic threshold, a practice documented in colonial garden records and archaeological plant remains recovered from farmhouse sites. A short distance from the house, screened somewhat by a stand of lilac or other modest shrubbery where possible, stands the household privy, a simple wooden outbuilding whose placement, as noted earlier, required careful thought to avoid contaminating the nearby well. Historians studying colonial sanitation practices note that such outbuildings, while simple by any modern standard, represented a genuine improvement in household hygiene management compared to some earlier colonial practices, and that families gradually developed a fairly sound, if informally understood, sense of appropriate distance and placement relative to water sources, wells, and the house itself. A woodpile, substantial in size and carefully stacked, occupies a significant portion of the dooryard as well. Its size this time of year a matter of real concern to the household, since sufficient firewood for the coming winter represented one of the most essential preparations any colonial farm family needed to complete before cold weather set in fully.
Historians estimate that a single New England household of this period might burn through many cords of wood across a single winter, given the relative inefficiency of open hearth heating compared to later stove technology, meaning that wood cutting and splitting occupied substantial labor time throughout the autumn months specifically to build this reserve. As midday approaches, this dooryard space becomes, briefly, a point of convergence for the scattered household. Elias and Josiah, returning from the far field with the ox team, pass through it on their way to unyoke and water the oxen before heading in for the midday meal. Margaret and Ruth, finishing their garden work, cross it on their way back toward the kitchen to prepare food. Even Sarah, her small apple-gathering basket now reasonably full, makes her way back across this same worn earth toward the house. For a few minutes then, the dooryard holds almost the entire household within its modest space, a brief daily convergence before the household disperses once more into the kitchen for the meal that awaits them.
The midday meal in colonial farm households typically represented the day's most substantial eating occasion, historians note, reflecting the genuine physical demands of a morning already spent in heavy agricultural labor, and the recognition that afternoon work would demand comparable energy before the day's end. The family gathers once more around the long kitchen table, the same table that hosted breakfast some hours earlier, now set with a more substantial spread. Margaret and good wife Anne have spent part of the late morning preparing this meal, alongside their other tasks, the hearth's cooking fire maintained steadily throughout the day, specifically to allow this kind of flexible, ongoing food preparation. Today's midday meal centers on a hearty stew, likely containing salt pork or, if recently available, fresh meat from the farm's own livestock, combined with vegetables from the kitchen garden, cabbage, onions, turnips, along with dried beans that have been soaking since the previous evening to reduce their cooking time. This one-pot cooking approach, historians emphasize, represented the dominant cooking method throughout colonial New England, well suited to the practical realities of open hearth cooking, where managing multiple separate dishes simultaneously required considerably more skill, equipment, and fuel than most households could easily manage on a daily basis. Alongside the stew, the family eats bread, likely a coarse mixture incorporating both wheat and rye or cornmeal, since pure wheat bread remains something of a luxury in a region where wheat cultivation proved less reliable than in colonies farther south. Historians studying colonial diet note the widespread use of what was sometimes called rye and Indian bread, combining rye flour with cornmeal, a practical adaptation reflecting both regional agricultural conditions and the influence of indigenous corn cultivation on colonial foodways. A wedge of hard cheese, produced from an earlier batch of the farm's own milk and aged for several weeks in the cool cellar, might also appear on the table today. Cheesemaking representing another significant component of Margaret's dairy responsibilities, requiring rennet, careful temperature management over the open hearth, and considerable patience during the pressing and aging process that followed. Historians studying colonial foodways note that cheese, unlike fresh milk or butter, could be stored for extended periods, making it a genuinely valuable component of winter food security once the household's single cow's milk production slowed considerably during the colder months ahead. The meal likely also includes some of the recently harvested apples, eaten fresh, along with cider, the household's staple daily beverage, produced from the farm's own orchard and stored in barrels in the cellar, where it would gradually ferment into a mildly alcoholic drink considered perfectly appropriate for family consumption, including, in modest quantities, for children, a practice that reflects genuinely different period understandings of alcohol, safety, and childhood than those common today. Conversation around the table during this meal tends to be somewhat fuller than the brief exchanges of breakfast, since the midday meal typically allowed slightly more time for rest before afternoon work resumed. Elias might report on the morning's progress clearing the far field, perhaps mentioning plans for the afternoon, continuing that same clearing work, or shifting attention toward woodcutting, given the approaching need to build the household's winter fuel supply. Margaret and Ruth might discuss the state of the garden harvest, or mention the cream currently rising in the buttery, ready for churning perhaps tomorrow. Goodwife Anne, having spent the morning's hours largely in quiet, repetitive spinning, sometimes uses this midday gathering as an opportunity to share stories or recollections from her own younger years, a pattern historians note as significant, since oral transmission of family history, practical knowledge, and community memory represented an important, if informally structured, part of colonial domestic education, particularly for younger family members like Sarah and Ruth. After the meal concludes, a brief period of rest typically follows, though rarely an extended one. Historians studying colonial labor patterns note that the demands of agricultural and domestic production left little room for substantial leisure time, even at midday, though a short pause to allow food to settle before resuming heavy physical work was both practically sensible and widely observed. Josiah, in particular, might use these few minutes to check or sharpen a tool needed for the afternoon's continued work, while Elias steps briefly outside to assess the sky and consider how much daylight remains for the tasks he hopes to accomplish before evening. Historians emphasize that colonial farmers developed considerable skill in reading weather signs, cloud formations, wind direction, the behavior of animals, knowledge accumulated through generations of close observation rather than any scientific meteorological understanding, but often remarkably reliable nonetheless. As the brief midday pause draws to its end, the family once again begins dispersing toward their afternoon tasks, the rhythm of the working day resuming almost seamlessly from where it paused, carrying the household forward into the long afternoon hours ahead.
Not every hour of a colonial farm day was consumed by fieldwork or major domestic production. A considerable portion of daily labor, particularly during the transitional hours of early afternoon, involved smaller-scale but equally essential tasks, tool maintenance, simple repairs, and the countless small acts of craftsmanship required to keep a largely self-sufficient household functioning. Barrels and other wooden storage vessels essential for everything from cider and salted meat to grain storage similarly required occasional specialized attention from the local cooper, whose craft demanded skills well beyond ordinary household woodworking. The Whitfields own a modest number of barrels and wooden buckets, some purchased new from the cooper, others repaired at home when a hoop loosened or a stave cracked, a distinction between simple maintenance and genuine craft production that colonial farm families understood clearly and respected in their own practical division of labor between household self-sufficiency and specialized village trades. This afternoon, Elias turns his attention briefly to a wooden-handled hoe that has developed a crack near its joint, a common wear pattern for tools subjected to constant heavy use. Rather than replacing the tool entirely, a genuine expense for a farm household of modest means, he works to repair it, using skills that colonial farmers typically developed out of practical necessity rather than formal training. Historians studying colonial material culture emphasize just how broadly capable rural households needed to be, with farmers routinely performing basic woodworking, leatherworking, and metalworking repairs themselves, reserving trips to specialized craftsmen like blacksmiths or coopers for more complex work genuinely beyond household capability. This modest collection of hand tools, most stored in the barn or in a small lean-to workshop space, axes for felling and splitting wood, augers for boring holes, a simple set of woodworking tools, including chisels and a draw knife, and various agricultural implements, from hoes and rakes to the more substantial equipment used with the ox team. Probate inventories surviving from this period, historians note, frequently list farm tools individually and with notable specificity, reflecting both their practical importance and their genuine monetary value within a household's assets. Meanwhile, inside the farmhouse, Margaret and goodwife Anne turn their attention to mending, a nearly constant background task within colonial domestic labor. Clothing, given the enormous labor investment required to produce cloth from raw fiber, was mended and remended extensively rather than discarded, a practice reflecting both genuine economic necessity and a broader cultural attitude toward material goods considerably different from modern disposable consumption patterns. Josiah's work shirt, torn slightly at the shoulder seam during the morning's fieldwork, receives careful attention, Margaret's needle moving with the same practiced efficiency evident in nearly every domestic task she undertakes. Ruth, now old enough to contribute meaningfully to this work, mends a smaller tear in one of Sarah's garments under her mother's occasional guidance, this kind of supervised practical instruction representing, as we discussed earlier, the primary method through which colonial girls acquired the substantial body of domestic skill expected of adult women. Sewing needles, thread, and the various small tools of textile work, thimbles, scissors, pins, represented genuinely valued possessions within colonial households, frequently mentioned specifically in wills and inventories, reflecting their practical importance despite their modest individual size and cost. This period of smaller-scale craft and repair work also sometimes extends to household items beyond clothing. A wooden bowl with a developing crack might receive careful attention. A broken chair rung might be reset and re-glued using materials the household produces itself. A worn pewter spoon might be set aside for eventual remelting and recasting, since pewter, unlike ceramic, could be melted down and reformed, extending the useful life of household metalware considerably. Not every repair, of course, fell within the household's own capability. Iron tools requiring forging or significant reshaping, for instance, needed the specialized skill of the local blacksmith, whose shop in the nearby town served farms throughout the surrounding area. Elias makes the journey there only occasionally when a genuinely broken plow iron or a badly worn axe head demands professional attention beyond what home repair could accomplish. And such visits, historians note, often doubled as further opportunities for the kind of informal community news exchange described elsewhere in this documentary. Blacksmith shops functioning in many rural towns as informal gathering points where farmers from scattered surrounding farms crossed paths while waiting for their own work to be completed. Historians studying colonial craftsmanship emphasize that this constant small-scale maintenance work, easily overlooked in favor of more dramatic seasonal labor like harvest or planting, in fact consumed a substantial cumulative portion of colonial household time and represented genuine skill, patience, and resourcefulness, qualities essential to sustaining a largely self-sufficient rural household across the demanding cycle of colonial agricultural life. As the afternoon continues, this quieter, more detailed work gradually gives way once more to larger tasks as attention throughout the household turns toward the remaining hours of daylight and the work still needed before evening arrives.
Colonial farm life, though centered heavily on the individual household, was rarely as isolated as modern audiences sometimes imagine. This afternoon, as if to illustrate the point, a neighbor arrives at the Whitfield farm,
a somewhat common occurrence in rural communities where cooperation and mutual assistance between households represented genuine practical necessity rather than mere social nicety. The visitor, a man from a neighboring farm, perhaps a mile distant, has come to discuss borrowing the Whitfield's ox team for a few days the following week, his own oxen currently occupied with similar clearing work on his own land. This kind of informal resource-sharing arrangement, historians studying colonial rural communities note, formed an essential part of the practical economic fabric connecting neighboring farm families, who frequently lent tools, draft animals, and labor to one another, understanding implicitly that such assistance would eventually be reciprocated when their own needs arose. Elias and the visiting neighbor speak briefly near the barn, their conversation covering not only the practical matter of the oxen, but also, as was typical of such exchanges, broader community news, the condition of other farms' harvests this season, recent births, illnesses, or deaths within the local community, and perhaps some mention of matters discussed at the most recent town meeting, since local governance in New England towns of this period typically involved direct participation from eligible male householders, making town meetings genuine sources of both civic decision-making and community information exchange. Historians studying colonial rural social networks emphasize that these seemingly casual exchanges served crucial functions beyond their immediate practical content, maintaining the web of relationships, obligations, and shared knowledge that bound rural communities together, particularly important in an era without newspapers reaching most rural households regularly, and long before any faster means of communication existed. Margaret, meanwhile, exchanges brief greetings with the neighbor's wife, who has accompanied her husband on this visit, their conversation touching on more domestic matters, the progress of each household's harvest preparations, perhaps an exchange of information about a recipe or a remedy for some minor ailment, and inquiries about mutual acquaintances in the small, tightly interconnected community of families who worshipped together, attended the same town meetings, and often were connected through generations of intermarriage between local farm families. Such visits, while genuinely valued for their social content, remained relatively brief, given the demanding schedule both households maintained. Within perhaps half an hour, the neighbor and his wife depart, the matter of the oxen settled amicably, with plans to finalize the arrangement more specifically when the actual need arises the following week. This kind of community interconnection extended well beyond casual visiting to encompass more structured forms of cooperation as well. The husking bees mentioned earlier, communal wood-cutting efforts, barn raisings when new agricultural buildings needed construction, and shared religious observance at the local meeting house all reinforced these community bonds regularly throughout the year. Historians note that colonial rural communities, despite their genuine geographic dispersal across individual farmsteads, functioned in many respects as cohesive social units, their members bound together by mutual economic interdependence, shared religious practice, and generations of accumulated family relationship. The Whitfield's own extended family, in fact, includes several relatives living on nearby farms, a married sister of Elias's a few miles distant, and cousins on Margaret's side within the same town, relationships that further reinforced this dense web of local connection, providing additional sources of practical assistance, shared labor during particularly demanding seasonal tasks, and simple companionship within lives that otherwise involved considerable daily isolation on individual scattered farmsteads.
The town center itself, perhaps 2 or 3 miles from the Whitfield farm, remains largely out of sight and out of mind on an ordinary working day like this one, though its presence shapes the family's life in ways felt more than constantly visible. There stands the meeting house, the town's central civic and religious building, along with a scattering of other structures, the blacksmith's shop mentioned in an earlier chapter, perhaps a small tavern serving travelers along the main road, and a country store where farm families like the Whitfields periodically trade their surplus butter, eggs, and homespun cloth for the modest range of manufactured or imported goods they cannot produce for themselves: tea, sugar, nails, cloth of a finer weave than their own homespun, and occasionally small luxuries like ribbon or window glass. Historians studying colonial rural commerce note that most farm families visited such a town center only irregularly, perhaps weekly for Sabbath meeting attendance, and somewhat less often for trade or errands. The bulk of their working lives, instead, centered almost entirely on their own farmstead and its immediate surroundings. As the neighbor's visit concludes and the farm settles back into its ordinary afternoon rhythm, this brief interruption serves as a useful reminder that even the most seemingly self-contained colonial household existed within and depended upon this broader web of rural community relationship, a pattern of interdependence that shaped colonial New England life as fundamentally as any individual family's own labor and resources.
Religious belief and practice occupied a genuinely significant place within colonial New England household life, though, as we noted earlier regarding the family's morning grace, this significance expressed itself primarily through quiet, integrated daily custom rather than dramatic or separate religious occasion. The Whitfield family, like the substantial majority of their New England neighbors during this period, would most likely have belonged to the local Congregationalist meeting house, the descendant institution of the earlier Puritan churches established by the region's original English colonists more than a century before. Historians studying colonial religious life emphasize that this Congregationalist tradition, while still dominant across much of rural New England by the 1770s, had evolved considerably from its stricter 17th century origins, shaped by several waves of religious revival and gradual theological diversification across the preceding decades. For a family like the Whitfields, religious practice would have structured the week significantly, with the Sabbath observed from Saturday evening through Sunday according to traditional reckoning, involving attendance at the local meeting house for lengthy services, sometimes lasting much of the day, with a substantial break at midday. Historians note that meeting house attendance served purposes extending well beyond narrowly religious observance, functioning also as one of the primary occasions for broader community gathering, since farm families gathered across considerable distances would otherwise have limited regular opportunity to see one another during the working week. On this particular weekday, however, religious practice within the Whitfield household expresses itself more modestly through the kind of quiet, habitual observance woven into the fabric of ordinary daily life. Grace before meals, as we saw at breakfast, represents one such moment. This evening, as we will see shortly, the family's practice likely includes some form of evening prayer or scripture reading as well, a common pattern documented extensively in surviving colonial household accounts and religious instruction manuals of the period. Historians studying colonial religious material culture point to the household Bible itself as one of the most consistently valued possessions across colonial New England families, regardless of specific economic circumstance, often the single most expensive book a family owned, sometimes using additional practical functions as well. Many families used the blank pages at a Bible's front or back to record important family events, births, marriages, and deaths, creating in the process a genuinely significant historical record that scholars continue to study today.
Belief itself, for a family like the Whitfields, would most likely have encompassed both the formal theological content taught at their local meeting house and a broader set of folk beliefs and practices common throughout rural New England during this period. Beliefs about the influence of moon phases on planting and animal husbandry, certain traditional remedies for illness that blended practical herbal knowledge with beliefs about their broader spiritual efficacy, and various customary practices surrounding major life events like birth, marriage, and death. Historians studying colonial popular religion emphasize that this blending of formal religious doctrine with older folk tradition and practical custom was extremely common throughout the period, reflecting a genuinely complex and layered religious culture, rather than the more simplified popular image of austere, uniformly strict Puritan belief, sometimes associated with colonial New England. Major life events, when they occurred within a household like the Whitfields, typically carried both practical and religious dimensions closely intertwined. Childbirth, for instance, took place within the home itself, assisted by a local midwife and typically attended by female relatives and neighbors, a genuinely communal occasion in an era before hospital birth existed as any kind of common practice. Death, similarly, was handled largely within the home and the immediate community, the deceased typically laid out in that best room or parlor mentioned earlier, with burial arranged in the local churchyard, the entire process managed by family and neighbors rather than the more removed, professionalized funeral practices that would develop in later centuries. It bears repeating, in the spirit of the balanced, evidence-based approach this documentary aims to maintain throughout, that we cannot know with certainty the specific theological views or personal religious experience of any specific family precisely like the Whitfields, since they represent, as explained at the outset, a composite reconstruction drawn from broader historical patterns rather than a specific documented household. What we can say, based on surviving records from families across the region during this period, is that religious practice of the kind we have described here, quiet, habitual, deeply integrated into daily domestic rhythm rather than separated from it, represented a widespread and historically well-documented pattern among rural New England farm families of the 1770s. As the afternoon light begins its slow autumn decline toward evening, we turn now from these quieter reflections back toward the practical work still remaining before the Whitfield household's long day can properly draw to its close. As afternoon advances, the Whitfield household's attention turns increasingly toward one of the season's most critical ongoing tasks: preserving the harvest to sustain the family through the long winter months ahead, when fresh food production would essentially cease until spring planting resumed. Margaret and goodwife Anne, joined periodically by Ruth as her other tasks allow, spend a significant portion of this afternoon processing vegetables gathered from the kitchen garden over recent days. Cabbages are being prepared for storage, some destined for the root cellar to be kept whole and fresh as long as possible, others perhaps beginning the process of fermentation into a preserved form, a practice historians note was well established throughout colonial New England, drawing on food preservation traditions brought from England and adapted to locally available produce. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, and the recently harvested potatoes, which had become an increasingly common crop throughout New England by this period, despite their somewhat later introduction to English colonial agriculture compared to native crops like corn and beans, are being sorted carefully. Damaged or blemished specimens set aside for immediate use, sound vegetables packed carefully into the root cellar's sand or straw-lined storage bins, where cool, stable temperatures and controlled humidity would allow them to remain edible for months.
Historians studying colonial food preservation emphasize the sheer scale of labor this seasonal preservation effort demanded, representing weeks of concentrated work compressed into the relatively narrow window between harvest and the arrival of hard, killing frost. A household's entire winter food security depended substantially on the effectiveness and thoroughness of this autumn preservation labor, making it, despite its relatively unglamorous, repetitive nature, one of the genuinely highest stakes periods of the entire agricultural year. Salt, an essential preservation resource that colonial households typically could not produce themselves in inland regions like the Whitfields, represented one of the more significant purchased goods a farm family required, often obtained through trade at the local country store in exchange for butter, eggs, or other farm produce, as we discussed earlier regarding the household's participation in the broader local barter economy. A portion of the apple harvest, too large to store or dry entirely, will soon go towards cider production, using a simple wooden press that the Whitfields, like many farm families of modest means, share with several neighboring households rather than owning outright, the press moving between farms on a loosely arranged rotation each autumn. Historians note that cider represented one of colonial New England's most widely consumed beverages across all ages and social classes, valued both for its taste and for the practical fact that fermentation rendered it considerably safer to drink than untreated water in an era without modern water sanitation. The pressing itself, when the Whitfield's turn with the shared press arrives in the coming days, will likely become another small occasion of shared neighborly labor, several families' apples processed across a single busy afternoon. Meanwhile, at some distance from this vegetable and fruit preservation work, Elias and Josiah continue their own afternoon labor, having shifted, as Elias had anticipated over the midday meal, from field clearing toward wood cutting, recognizing the pressing need to continue building the household's winter fuel reserve before the true cold arrives. The rhythmic sound of the axe, steady and unhurried, carries faintly across the farmyard throughout much of the remaining afternoon, punctuated occasionally by the sharper crack of a split log. Historians estimate, based on surviving records and later documented usage patterns, that a colonial New England household of this size might require somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 cords of firewood to see them through a full winter season, an almost startling quantity by modern standards, reflecting both the genuine severity of New England winters during this period, falling, as it did, within what climate historians term the Little Ice Age, a period of somewhat cooler average temperatures across much of the Northern Hemisphere, and the relative inefficiency of open hearth heating compared to enclosed stove technology that would only become widespread in the following century. As the afternoon sun begins its gradual decline toward the western ridge, the accumulated labor of this long harvest season day, preserved vegetables filling the root cellar, dried apple slices accumulating near the hearth, split wood fire adding steadily to the dooryard woodpile, represents in its quiet, cumulative way the genuine substance of colonial rural survival. Not dramatic events, but patient, repeated, essential work, performed day after day across the changing seasons.
As the afternoon light begins its unmistakable shift toward evening, the sun dropping lower, its angle growing longer and more golden across the farmyard and surrounding fields, the Whitfield household's attention turns once more toward the daily cycle of evening chores that must precede the household's evening meal and eventual rest. Elias and Josiah, having spent much of the afternoon at wood cutting,
now turned back toward the barn for the second of the day's 2 milking sessions, along with the broader evening routine of settling the farm's livestock for the night. The oxen, unyoked earlier in the day, receive fresh water and feed before being secured in their stalls. The pigs, similarly, received their evening feeding, household scraps supplemented with whatever additional feed the farm can spare. The chickens, having spent the day ranging relatively freely around the farmyard, require gathering back into the barn or a dedicated henhouse structure for the night, both for warmth and, significantly, for protection from predators. Foxes, weasels, and occasionally larger threats like bobcats, or in the more heavily wooded areas of colonial New England, even the occasional bear, remained genuine practical concerns for farm households maintaining poultry and smaller livestock. Josiah moves through the farmyard, gathering the scattered birds with the easy competence of someone who has performed this same task countless times before. Margaret's evening milking follows a similar process to the morning session described earlier. The cow's full udder relieved once more, the gathered milk strained and set aside in the buttery alongside whatever portion of this morning's milk has yet not been used, continuing the ongoing dairy production cycle that will, over coming days, eventually yield the household's butter supply. As these evening barn chores continue, the sky above the farm undergoes its characteristic autumn transformation, the sun's angle growing increasingly golden and then deepening toward orange as it approaches the western tree line, casting long shadows across the stubbled far field and the farmhouse's weathered clapboard walls. Historians and those who study colonial daily rhythms note that this evening transition represented a genuinely significant psychological and practical shift within the working day, the approaching darkness imposing its own natural discipline on the household's activities, since meaningful outdoor work became increasingly difficult and eventually impossible without proper illumination. Inside the farmhouse, Goodwife Anne and Sarah, whose day's labor has been somewhat lighter than the rest of the household, given their respective limitations of age, begin preparations for the evening meal, working alongside whatever ingredients Margaret has set aside earlier from the day's harvest and preservation work. The hearth fire, maintained steadily throughout the entire day, now receives additional attention, built up somewhat to provide both cooking heat and the beginning of the evening's primary source of both light and warmth as full darkness approaches. Candles and lamps, while present within the household, remained relatively precious resources throughout this period. Beeswax candles particularly expensive, tallow candles made from rendered animal fat more commonly used by ordinary farm families, despite their somewhat less pleasant smell and dimmer light, and oil lamps requiring purchased fuel that represented another modest but real household expense. Historians emphasize that colonial households, as a consequence, typically relied heavily on the hearth fire itself for evening illumination whenever possible, reserving candles and lamps for tasks specifically requiring more concentrated light, such as reading or fine needlework. As Elias and Josiah complete the barn's evening settling and make their way back across the darkening dooryard towards the house, the day's heaviest labor has, for all practical purposes, concluded. What remains is the evening meal, the quieter domestic activities that typically fill the colonial household's remaining waking hours, and eventually the household's gradual settling toward sleep. The barnyard at this hour takes on a particular character historians and those who study rural material life often note, quite distinct from its bustle earlier in the day. The animals, fed and settling, grow quieter.
The oxen shift occasionally in their stalls, the faint sound of their movement and steady breathing audible in the barn's stillness. Somewhere in the rafters, roosting birds settle themselves for the night with small, diminishing sounds. The overall effect farm families across generations have described in various ways is one of a working day visibly and audibly winding down, the farm's whole rhythm shifting gears in a manner every member of the household, human and animal alike, seem to sense together. The transition from the day's demanding physical labor towards this calmer evening rhythm was, historians note, a genuinely welcome and consistent feature of colonial rural life, the fading light itself imposing a natural, unhurried boundary between the working day and the household's more restful hours. A boundary considerably more absolute and less negotiable than most modern households, with their artificial lighting extending productive hours well past sunset, typically experience today.
By the time full darkness settles fully over the farm, the Whitfield family has gathered once more around their kitchen table, now illuminated primarily by the warm, flickering light of the hearth fire, supplemented perhaps by a single tallow candle set near wherever the evening's activities require slightly more concentrated illumination. This evening's supper, historians note, typically represented a somewhat lighter meal than the midday dinner, reflecting both the reduced physical demands of the remaining evening hours and simple practical convenience, since a lighter meal required less extensive preparation after an already demanding day. Tonight's supper likely consists of the remaining pottage or stew from midday, reheated over the hearth, accompanied by bread, perhaps some of the fresh cheese the household has been producing periodically from their dairy surplus, and cider once more, as the standard household beverage. The family eats together at their familiar table, the conversation this evening typically somewhat more relaxed than the practical, task-focused exchanges of breakfast or the midday meal, since the day's major labor has concluded, and the evening ahead promises, relatively speaking, a measure of rest. Elias might share a fuller account of the afternoon's woodcutting progress, perhaps estimating how much of the winter's fuel supply now remains to be gathered. Margaret and goodwife Anne discuss the preservation work accomplished today, perhaps planning tomorrow's continuation of the same essential harvest season labor. After supper concludes, the family typically remains gathered near the hearth for a period historians describe as one of the genuinely valued social occasions within the colonial household's daily rhythm. An evening period, sometimes referred to informally as the family's time for what contemporary sources occasionally called fireside activities, encompassing a range of quieter tasks and forms of togetherness that filled the hours between supper and eventual sleep. Tonight, this evening period includes continued mending work, Margaret and Ruth's needles catching the firelight as they complete tasks begun earlier in the day, alongside perhaps some additional carding or spinning from goodwife Anne, whose failing eyesight makes such repetitive, tactile work more practical during evening hours than reading or finer needlework requiring sharper vision. Josiah, meanwhile, might occupy this evening time with some small task of his own, perhaps continuing work on a simple wooden object, whittling or carving being a common evening pastime for colonial farm boys, sometimes producing genuinely useful household items like spoons or small tools, sometimes simply representing a practical outlet for restless hands during the household's quieter hours. This evening, as is apparently a regular practice within the household, Elias reads briefly aloud from the family's Bible, a common pattern documented extensively across colonial New England household accounts of this period,
representing both genuine religious observance and simultaneously one of relatively few opportunities within the demanding rhythm of colonial daily life for shared reading and reflection as a complete family unit. Sarah, likely growing drowsy by this point in the long day, listens from her place near her mother, while Ruth and Josiah attend with the more sustained attention of children old enough to follow and reflect on the reading's content. Historians studying colonial family life emphasize that evenings like this one, gathered together near the hearth, engaged in this kind of quiet, mixed activity, practical work, reading, occasional conversation, represented some of the only sustained periods of genuine family togetherness within an otherwise demanding, labor-divided daily schedule, when morning through late afternoon typically scattered household members across their separate but interconnected tasks. Alongside scripture reading, oral storytelling occupied a genuine place in colonial evening custom, particularly in households like the Whitfields with an elder family member such as Goodwife Anne present. Her stories tonight, drawn perhaps from her own girlhood decades earlier, or handed down further still from her own parents' generation, offered the younger children a form of history considerably more immediate and personal than anything a book could provide, an oral thread of family memory stretching back toward the earliest generations of English settlement in this valley, a thread that, historians remind us, often preserved details of local history, practical knowledge, and family identity that never made their way into any written record at all. As the evening continues and the fire gradually burns lower, requiring periodic feeding with additional wood to maintain both warmth and light, the household's collective energy, understandably, begins its own gradual decline. Sarah's attention wanders increasingly toward drowsiness. Even Josiah, whose 14-year-old energy typically outlasts his younger sister's, shows signs of the day's accumulated physical labor beginning to catch up with him. Gradually, almost without any single decisive moment marking the transition, the household begins its final preparations for the night ahead.
As the evening reaches its final hours, the Whitfield household moves through the quiet, familiar rituals that close out nearly every day of their lives. Rituals shaped by generations of accumulated domestic custom and by the simple, practical necessities of maintaining a household through the changing seasons. The fire receives its final attention for the evening, built up somewhat before being banked once more for the night. The same careful process Margaret performed in reverse this morning, coals raked together and covered with ash to smolder slowly through the dark hours ahead, preserving enough heat and ember that tomorrow's fire can be coaxed back to life without needing to be struck entirely anew. This nightly banking of the hearth fire, historians note, represented a genuinely essential household skill, since a fire allowed to die completely overnight meant not only the loss of accumulated warmth, but the more laborious task of starting an entirely new fire from flint and steel the following morning. Sarah, drowsy well before the rest of the household, is likely already settled into the loft bed she shares with Ruth, the heavy woolen coverlet pulled close against the growing chill of the unheated upper room. Ruth, following not long after completing whatever final small task occupied her evening hours, joins her younger sister, the two girls settling together for warmth as much as companionship, a common and practical arrangement in colonial households where heating upper sleeping spaces adequately remained, as we have discussed, a genuine challenge throughout the colder months. Josiah, in his own space near the chimney's modest residual warmth, settles somewhat later,
perhaps after completing one final barn check alongside his father, confirming that the animals are properly secured for the night and that no obvious hazard, an improperly latched gate, a lantern left burning too near stored hay, threatens the farm's safety through the dark hours ahead. Fire, historians remind us, represented a genuine ongoing hazard of colonial rural life, and the careful, habitual precautions farm families like the Whitfields took each evening reflected hard-won collective experience with just how quickly a barn fire, once started, could destroy in a single night the accumulated labor and resources of an entire year or more. Elias and Margaret, typically the last members of the household to retire, use these final quiet minutes for a brief, low conversation, historians note, of the kind that surviving diary fragments and later reminiscences occasionally hint at. A final review of the day's accomplished work, brief plans for the following morning, perhaps some quiet acknowledgement of concerns that occupy a farming household this time of year. Whether the harvest preservation work will be completed before hard frost fully sets in, whether the wood supply will prove sufficient for the winter ahead, whether the borrowed oxen arrangement with their neighbor will proceed as discussed. Goodwife Anne, having set aside her spinning for the evening, retires to her own small sleeping space, her day's labor, though physically lighter than that of the younger household members, nonetheless representing a genuine and valued contribution to the household's ongoing textile production, work that would continue day after day through the coming winter months. Outside, the farmhouse stands dark now, except for the faint glow of banked coals visible through small window openings, the surrounding farmyard and fields settling into the particular deep quiet of rural night, broken only occasionally by the distant call of an owl, the rustle of wind through the remaining leaves of the orchard trees, or the settling creak of the timber-framed house itself, adjusting gently to the falling night temperature. This has been, by any measure, an entirely ordinary day, one of perhaps 20,000 such days that made up an adult colonial farmer's working lifetime, indistinguishable in its broad outline from the days before it and the days that will follow, through the remaining weeks of harvest season, through the deepening cold of winter, and eventually into another spring planting season beyond. Historians who trace the full agricultural year of households like this one describe this seasonal ebb and flow as one of the defining rhythms of colonial rural life, labor intensifying and easing in a pattern dictated not by any employer or clock, but by the land itself, and by the simple, unbroken necessity of preparing each year for the one that follows. As the last coals settle into their ashy covering and the farmhouse and its sleeping family fade into the deep quiet of an autumn night nearly 250 years past, we hope this quiet, ordinary day has offered you the same thing it offered them, in its own way, each evening, a gentle release from the demands of the day and the slow, settling approach of rest. If this journey into an ordinary colonial evening helped you unwind, we would be glad to have you join us for future episodes here at Bedtime Story Media. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us. Sleep well.